Yes, as you can see, this is the title of my presentation. I would like to provide a general introduction to the subject of Jewish settlements, their topography, and ritual culture in general. To this day, Jews are regarded as predominant urban settlers who lived in restricted areas of medieval cities in quarters that were allocated by Christian authorities, by the bishop, or even by the emperor himself. Such notable Jewish settlements are the so-called Shum communities, Speyer, Worms, Mainz, but also Cologne, as well as Trier, Regensburg, Würzburg, and Erfurt. These communities have existed almost for a millennium, and their history can be traced from the 10th, 11th century to the 20th century, but is marked by repeated break, which means the Crusaders pogroms starting with 1096, the persecutions at the turn of the 13th to the 14th century, and ultimately the annihilation of these communities during the Black Death in 1349-1350. They altered Jewish life in Ashkenaz profoundly, and the subsequent period until the end of the 15th century has been marked by decline and repeated expulsions. From the 16th to the end of the 18th century, only Worms and Frankfurt showed a constant Jewish settlement, and this only in the so-called Judengasse, which many consider to be in fact a ghetto. Urban Jewish resettlement took place only in the 19th century, albeit in very different structures, and a community blossomed again until the Shoah, when Jewish life has been destroyed in the most cruel way. Yet, despite this turbulent history, Jewish communities managed to keep up their ritual organization, which ensured communal coherence and tradition, but also created a specific living space, a distinct Jewish topography. In the following, I would like to discuss the medieval emergence of distinct Jewish topographies within the Shum communities under a dual perspective. The external perspective, which means the interest that might have guided local authorities to grant settlement to Jewish communities in these imperial cathedral cities, and second, the internal perspective, and this in which way did the rituals shape the infrastructure of the settlement and marked its civic progress. As time is limited, I would like to focus on the Jewish community of Worms. In today's memory, the Worms Judengasse presents a narrow and crowded street along the northern city wall. The wall is said to have been started as a powerful construction in the 11th century at instigation of the bishop first and the emperor, especially Henry IV, later. But new archaeological analysis points to the fact that it was set in stone during the 12th century only, and that Jewish houses were directly built into the wall with windows facing outwards. As such, the houses of the Judengasses must have been among the earliest civic stone dwellings of Worms, as was the first synagogue, which has been constructed in 1034, according to the donor's inscription, still visible next to the portal, right here, of the new communal synagogue, constructed in 1174-75, together with the mikveh, constructed in 1186, and the so-called Tanzhaus, which served as a dancing hall, community meeting hall, and the Beit Midrash since around 1200, and later as a rabbi's home, a hospital, and an inn. These impressive buildings formed the nucleus of medieval Jewish life. In 1213-1215, a women's school has been added to the synagogue, the first of its kind. The Jewish cemetery, which probably has been set up in the 11th century, perhaps at the time of the first synagogue, is somewhat distantly located near the cathedral outside of the medieval walls. This early ensemble of impressive stone architecture was complemented by detailed legal statutes, so-called takanot, of the Keynote, which appeared for the first time in Britain around 1220 and assembled traditional and contemporaneous rabbinic regulations regarding civil life and ritual laws from the 10th century onwards. The takanot established the three communities as major centers of Jewish life in Europe, which also held power over the surrounding smaller Jewish settlements, and it was decreed that all those living outside but using the cemetery as their burial place would have to address the Beit Din of the central Jewish community regarding legal matters. Moreover, they had to take part in the Kol Nidre service at the synagogue on Yom Kippur and bring their Yizkor candles to be lit there. Why such an extraordinary takana for just one single custom? These extra large candles of beeswax were regarded as ritual implements and served only for remembering the dead, a custom which started most likely after the pogrom of 1096. It became a distinct Ashkenazi custom, especially of the Menagrenos, complete with reading the names of the martyrs and the dead from a memo book. The first one is recorded in 1296. For the ritual, the huge candles were placed on the side steps of the eruv, as you can see it here. See these huge candles. At the beginning of the Kol Nidre service, as is shown in a single leaf from an early 14th century Machzor, which most likely originated in the vicinity of Hagenau, near North Alsace, according to the coat of arms. I could identify four of these, or not, five of these coats of arms, and they all point to noble families around Hagenau. It shows the cantor, you see him right here, wrapped in his talit, following the read-through of the Shum communities, and this attests to the radiance of the Takanot Shum in the later 13th, early 14th century. It also shows that the emergence of new rituals, as the Yizkor, created a new common ground in time and space among the communities of the Minhag Renus. Within each community, the law of the eruv regulated the use of communal infrastructure during Shabbat and holidays, albeit there was a hot debate among rabbinic authorities in the 12th and 13th century in which way Christian houses and their Jewish residents were to be included in the eruv, as the decline has demonstrated. The discussion makes clear that these major medieval Jewish communities envisaged to maintain their own ritual space, but did not yet live in secluded areas as in later times. So the first picture that I did show you is somewhat misleading as it shows the state of the Jewish quarter in the 18th century, where it became exclusively a Jewish dwelling. On the other hand, there were ever more attempts by the Christian side to segregate Jews from the urban space of the Christian majorities, especially since the 13th century. Further regulations, such as the laws concerning the wedding service and its attached festivities, but also kosher slaughtering, show that everyday life was structured by an advanced and detailed ritual legislation. The Jewish wedding was a ceremony guided by religious and legal requirements, which led to an elaborate ceremony that conducted the groom publicly into the synagogue at first, followed by an entourage of Jewish students who, however, had to follow strict rules when it came to fees and food. Furthermore, the groom became the center of synagogue ritual, and in the time of the Maharil, which means around 1400, the bridal couple was even presented at the bima first, while the wedding ceremony proper was conducted outside at the courtyard of the synagogue. You see here a representation of the late 17th century in Erfurt, but it's still conducted according to the medieval rite. There, the veiled bride was conducted with great pomp and music, which was absolutely necessary. As the Maharil stated, a wedding without Jewish music was no wedding. To the spot on the courtyard of the synagogue, and the ketubah, the legal document, was read publicly in front of witnesses, thus ensuring publicly the legal base of the marriage. Moreover, the bride received a ring on her right index. In the Shem communities, most weddings were conducted on Fridays and continued over Shabbat, when the groom was called to the Torah, a ceremony which was accompanied by a distinct liturgy. To ensure strictly kosher wedding meal, followed by dancing at the Tanzhaus, even on Shabbat, the codron, with the cooked food, had to be guarded by a Jew in order to prevent unlawful adding of surplus water, especially by a Christian servant, to which most rabbis disagreed. The guard ensured thus a kosher wedding festival for all Jewish guests and the community, which most often also owned the huge cauldron. So the detailed regulations for a Jewish wedding become apparent. The elaborate wedding ceremonial was a public festivity in the eyes of the entire community and apparently followed a fixed itinerary through the Jewish quarter and thus designed a ritual space beyond the buildings. Moreover, it seems that medieval Jewish wedding rituals were far more advanced regarding their religious, legal, and social impact than contemporary Christian ceremonies, which where the sacralization by the Church gained new momentum only during the 13th century. The elaborate customs point again to a Jewish communal life as highly organized and well-structured, such marking a kind of urban avant-garde. It has often been said that Jewish ceremonies would follow the contemporary Christian development, but in this case, it remains to be asked who followed whom. As a third case, I would like to discuss some public aspects of the Passover ritual, such as the baking of the matzot, especially the matzah shmora. These regulations are not part of the Takanot Shum, but have been assembled and commented on by famous Worms scholars such as the Rokeach and the Maharam in the 13th century. The matzah shmora, that means the guarded matzah, is an important ritual prescribed and implemented on the Seder meal, and special care is required for preparation. The wheat has to be supervised from the process of grinding until baking in order to prevent any possible fermentation. In addition, the preparation is one of the latest steps before Passover Eve, and the dough has to be prepared in great haste. So I try to repeat. Yes, I'm in the mid of explaining